Hey guys, just going through Matthew chapter 24, and today we're going to look at verse 37. Here's what it says in the English Standard Version. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So this verse is normally, I believe, taken out of context. People read it as, oh, it's a global event. Um, So we're going to go through a study I made about this verse, and we're going to address why this is actually a localized day of Noah type of event. So I'm just going to go through what I have here, and then I'm going to hit one or two verses or things I want to mention, and then that'll be the end of the video. Um, so this verse, let me just show you it here. Okay, so here, whereas were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Right? So if we just first we read this in context, it says, but the verse before, but concerning that day and hour no one knows. So remember, when he's describing Noah, it has to be in context because the verse before it, he opens up this explanation about when this thing would happen actually, right? So when he says, but concerning that day, which day is he talking about? The day he just gave all these signs, right? Um, so he says, no one knows the day or the hour, but he didn't say he doesn't know the season, right? We think of the harvest, we know the season, what harvest is, right? Um, and the second of all, right, he just said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So we can't take it out of that kind of context of the first century generation. And then if we read after this verse, it says, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man, right? So we see immediately after this verse, does he get into how it's a big global event? Actually, he gets into how it was imminent and how imminent this event is. He says they were unaware. So what is he saying? He's saying you, his audience, needs to be aware. And then because the flood, it came and it took them all away. And he's saying, be aware. Like the time is now, it's here, get ready, it's at hand, it's very coming speedily, right? So we have all these time statements that we need to be aware of. But let's just get into, let's go actually look at something back in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2. So this is what world looked like before the flood came. So it says, verse 1, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. They took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards the sons of God came into the daughters of man. They bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So that gives us a lot of spiritual clues. The spiritual condition of the time before the flood came was very evil. They were in this habitual evil thoughts. They were having habitual evil thoughts and lies that were leading to habitual evil actions, right? And and I believe there was even dinosaurs were on the earth. It was probably a very terrible place to live, the planet Earth, before the flood. Um, Before the flood, right, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. They took as their wives any they chose. This mirrors how Moses, I just want to make this point, this mirrors, it's a parallel to how Moses was told by the Israelites to go and get a list of rules for them to follow. Now let me clarify, because that would be less fearful and seemingly more attractive a covenant to live under. And that's in Exodus. So before the flood, the sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. This mirrors how Moses was told by Israelites to go get a list of rules for them to follow, because that would be less fearful and seemingly more attractive a covenant to live under, right? So let me just explain that. So these sons of God, it doesn't really tell us much about them in here in Genesis chapter 6. The Nephilim, they're called the sons of God. They saw this thing as more attractive. This woman is more attractive than honoring God. In the same way, before this day like Noah in Jerusalem in AD 70, there was a lot of Christians who saw the law of Moses as more attractive. Right? They committed this sort of spiritual adultery with the covenant they were under, and with the covenant of the law of Moses instead. Let's see Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 to 8. So, verse 7. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Right. So Noah is a big character in terms of the covenant God made with him, right? And he was the righteous remnant that came through that flood. And the name of Noah means rest, right? And then Genesis chapter 7, let's just go skip to 7, verse 1. The Lord said, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Right? It was in that, when he says this generation in the Old Testament, it meant that time that Noah was living in. It says, Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are chosen, not clean, the male and his mate. 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens, also male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters came upon the earth. Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went with him, went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, and God commanded Noah. And after the 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of that month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Right? Rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons, entered with him into the ark, they and every beast according to its kind. and all the livestock according to their kinds, blah, blah, blah. They went into the ark with Noah. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. Something else to notice, just seeing is verse 17. So even with the more the flood comes, the more these trials come, the more all these things came in the first century for the Christians. Like it was 40 days, right? And like it was 40 years between Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem. So to me, that was like the flood was coming. It was testing them. There was a year they were like in the wilderness. This was a time when no matter how much the trials came, they were able to bear fruit throughout the whole earth, which means that they were able to rise above that, just like Noah and his ark was able to rise above the earth. So I think that's just a cool thing I just noticed. The waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Right, and think about mountains in this time. Mountains, right? There's a physical reality, and then there's the spiritual reality. So in the Old Testament, there was the mountain of the Lord. Right, Moses went up the mountain, Mount Mount Horeb, to get the Ten Commandments, and then there was the mountain of the Lord. It's a mountain made without human hands. It actually represents the kingdom of God, also called Mount Zion or Mount Jerusalem or the Mountain of David, the City of David. These are all sort of the same idea. It's a kingdom of God, and this is something that was not going to be built with human hands in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. So all these mountains being covered by the flood, to me that represents all the kingdoms of these earth being brought beneath all the saints that were being purified. They were able to prevail above all that stuff. That's something that I think could be true. I don't know. Agree or disagree? Let me know. And all the flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. So this was a total destruction of all the living flesh, right? So, and even flesh, I just want to show you something quickly in Romans chapter 6. Flesh there was the physical flesh, which showed us about the spiritual reality. So let's go to Romans just to look at that quickly. If we have been united with him in a death, verse 5, like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. So is this talking about a physical death that we die? No. It's talking about a spiritual thing that happens. Our old self, right, next verse, was crucified with him, in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin, right? So when Paul talks about the flesh, he's actually talking about, right, the sinful lusts of the flesh, the sinful nature, right, the sin as your master. This is what flesh kind of represents in the New Testament, right? Spiritual language. Okay. Now to explain that a little bit more, right? I said this parallels how the Egyptians were destroyed in the Red Sea. Okay, I didn't say that, but I'm saying that. And how the Israelites had bread rained down on them for 40 days in the desert. Or is it 40 years? For 40 years in the desert, right? So it was, yeah, so there was the 40 days, So let's see Hebrews. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 8. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my work for 40 years. Yeah, so it was 40 years. And I just want to see that verse. And then 16 to 20. For who were those who were heard and rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? Right, so we have a similar pattern to the flood where, right, those who were continuously evil had to be destroyed. And it rained for 40 days, right, a day for each year. Is seen in Ezekiel chapter 4. We see a day for each year. So sometimes God uses a day can represent a year. And we see that even with Jesus and the Red Sea and etc. Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? Verse 18. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient, right? Noah means rest. He was sort of the promised land. He was the Canaan of the desert, right? He was this righteous remnant that came through those 40 days of rain. This is something that a lot of people sort of miss, I think, these patterns and types and shadows. I just want to. So we see that they were unable to enter because of their unbelief. So, right, those sons of God, the Nephilim, they didn't trust God. They trusted these women that looked attractive, and they went after that, which was the easy way. And they were actually not able to enter through the flood because of their unbelief, right? Because of their distrust in God. So let's go to Exodus. Like the day of testing in the wilderness was referenced in the New Testament. That was the point of showing you this verse. The day of testing in the wilderness. I just want to show you that. So let's go to Exodus chapter 16, verse 3. And so the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Let's go to verse 7. Keep going. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, right? So it's raining again. Why is it raining again, right? The people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. We see that even in Genesis with Adam and Eve being created on the sixth day, which represented God making his new covenant, right? Eve was this new covenant figure. I'll explain that in a different study. Let's see, verse 6. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. Wow. What are we that you grumble against us, right? So this verse is amazing. It lines up with everything in preterism, because the glory of the Lord was to be at the second coming of Christ, which was to happen in the morning of the seventh day, which was entering into the rest that came after the 40 years in the wilderness, or the rest that Noah had after the 40 years of, or 40 days of rain. So there's all these parallels again and again and again, and it makes sense. It's simple. It connects, right? And the fruit of it is good. So, right, yeah. So they were grumbling, right? Why didn't we just go back to Egypt? And they were complaining. This parallels, right? Probably what was happening during the flood, even. They were complaining that this rain won't stop, right? I'm sure there was much wailing and stuff going on then. And again, we see the persecution in the first century as the fulfillment of these things. Let's go actually to Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 1 to 8. Siege of Jerusalem symbolized. So this was AD 70, right? Jerusalem was besieged. This was the fulfillment of Jesus' biggest prophecy in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, etc. So let's just read verses 1 to 8. First, I'll say the book of Ezekiel was written for, it was prophesying the destruction of Babylon, or of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586 BC, I believe. It's not confirmed right now, but let's just read this verse because there's something I want to show. And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem. And put siege works against it, build a siege wall against it, cast up a mound against it, set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it all around. And you take an iron griddle, place it as an iron wall between you and the city, set your face toward it, let it be a state of siege, press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel. So a siege would be a sign. This is so big. A siege would be a sign of what? Let's keep reading. Then lie on your left side at the place of punishment of the house of Israel upon it. Right? Punishment we see Jesus giving the Jews, Matthew 23. For the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign you a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of the years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. Right? This was like Israel was in Egypt for almost 400 years. Similar, right? I don't know how it lines up exactly. I haven't looked at that. But let's keep reading. And when you have completed these, verse 6, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. So this would be actually matches up with the Daniel 9 70 weeks prophecy, which is really cool. Which we'll study later. There's people that sell books about that. You can ask me. When you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side bear the punishment of the house of Judah. So this is big because like Israel had already been destroyed. They've already been exiled from the whole thing, all of like northern Israel. But all that's left is this small house of Judah. And Jesus was going to come and he was going to deal with this house of Judah. And this was the Israel that was left when he came. So 40 days I assign you, a day for each year. This is amazing because it lines up perfectly with what Jesus did. Right, he was baptized and then he was in the desert for 40 days. He was crucified and then he was preached for 40 days before he ascended into heaven. And then what do we see? Right, even after that, there was also 40 years until the destruction of Jerusalem. There's that siege towards the end of that. And we see that fulfilling all sorts of stuff that we've studied, that I hope we get to study even. And you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared. You shall prophesy against the city. And behold, I will place cords upon you so that you cannot turn from one side to the other till you have completed the days of your siege, right? So he was under a lot of stress. He was enduring till the end. This is the guy, Ezekiel, who is actually called the Son of Man in the book of Ezekiel. So he was this type and shadow of Jesus who was to come. And through the body of Christ, which was the church, right, he was going under this endurance during the 40 years leading up to the destruction of the Jews, the Jerusalem, who were persecuting them. So this is sort of the context, right? Yeah. So let's go to Matthew 23 and actually look at where Jesus predicts this siege of Jerusalem as a fulfillment, as a reality of this, what actually happened, right? Or not as a, but as another sort of fulfillment of a prophecy, just like this one. Because this was really a shadow and a lesson to be learned for what was happening in the first century. Let's go Matthew 23, verse 35 to 36. So he says, so that on you, right, who's he talking to? On who? Well, it's the hypocrites, it's the Pharisees, teachers of the law, who he was actually proclaiming their destruction, which already was prophesied in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, 28 to 32, where it declares the end of that old covenant system. Jesus is saying now is that time. He says, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. So this isn't just a local judgment. This is a big judgment all the way from the creation of the world. All that blood, from the blood of righteous Abel, right? Adam and Eve had Abel, Cain and Abel, to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. So Zechariah was one of the last prophets of the Old Testament. So he's saying all the way from the beginning to the end of that Old Testament, all that blood is going to come upon you. And that was what? Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So when he says this generation, he's not talking about some future generation. He didn't say that generation. He said this generation, which we see is this pattern of teaching, even from Noah. It said, remember God talked to Noah. He said, I see you are righteous in this generation. He wasn't talking about some future generation. Again, Jesus says this generation. He wasn't talking about some future generation, obviously. So then why all of a sudden in chapter 24, when the disciples are thinking about these things, they ask Jesus, what are you talking about? Why again do we actually interpret this generation? In verse 34, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So some people interpret that as, oh, that's some future generation, or it's talking about a generation sort of spiritually, and since nobody knows the day or the hour, it could be this generation that we're actually living in today in the 20th century. But that doesn't really make sense, right? Anyway, the point of showing in Matthew 23 was to show you another shadow of the siege of Jerusalem. The Pharisees, teachers of the law, which happened within 40 years, like the flood came for 40 days before killing all flesh, right? It was raining, it rained for 40 days, and then everybody died. In the same way, 40 years, the disciples preached the gospel. They were in sort of the spiritual wilderness of persecution from the old covenant system, which was coming to an end. And that was sort of, the Holy Spirit was raining on them. It was the teaching of God, right? It says the Spirit is the truth. In Deuteronomy, we see, let your teaching fall like rain. So this rain was coming for 40 years, a year for each day. And then the flood, the Holy Spirit rose up so high it destroyed that old covenant system and those old covenant mountains and this righteous remnant that was in this little boat on the spiritually way above, being exalted, and all those flesh things of the old covenant system, the rules, the regulations, and the pride of man were brought low, right? Every mountain low, every valley raised up. That's talking about kingdoms and authorities. Just think about that for a minute, right? Let's go to Matthew chapter 4. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Right? So Jesus, he fasted for 40 days, 40 nights in the wilderness. The tempter came, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Right? So that's just to show you, Jesus was baptized, then he entered into the wilderness, a day for each year. This all represents the covenant transition period from 30 AD, when he sort of finished his ministry, until 70 AD. And then I want to go to Genesis chapter 8 in verse 21 to 22. Let's go there. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground. This was after the flood. Noah gets out. He's built, you can read the chapter yourself if you want. I read part of it, so I think we get an understanding. The flood waters are lowering. Noah stops on this mountain. He says, verse 21, the pleasing aroma, I will never again, what? Curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night shall not cease. So he says, while the earth remains, right, it will remain. Some people so he made this covenant, and he's promising never to destroy the earth again. And yet we're teaching people out of this new covenant, which is based on these old covenant promises, that God's going to burn up every particle and everything by using fire instead of water, because God was saying he wouldn't use water. But he says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. So God promised never to do it again. How simple is that, right? God was not trying to creatively get around his covenant by using fire to destroy the earth instead of water. Just like how there is only one baptism, right? There's in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5, there's only one baptism. And yeah, the Israelites only had to go through the Red Sea once. And then, yes, they had to cross into Canaan, they had to destroy a city. But guess what? That city's been destroyed through that flood. So, let's go 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18 to 21. There's two more verses I want to look at today. After this one. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, but that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. So this is a cool verse. Because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. So this was a shadow, right? Peter wrote this before the destruction of Jerusalem. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. So, right, he was just talking about the flood, and then he's talking about baptism. So it's not like a separate thing. That flood symbolized that sort of baptism. And there was only one baptism, right? How many times does God have to destroy the flesh of man, right? Only once. It's done, right? He doesn't have to flood the earth again because he made a covenant through destroying it the first time. You entered into that covenant. That's why you only get baptized. You need to get baptized once, because as soon as you do, God makes a covenant, and he's like, I'll never do that again. You're mine, and you're adopted. You don't have to get baptized again and again and again, although we do have this continual repentance and refinement. And God, because God, he always brought the remnant through the judgments after the flood. There's always the righteous remnant that was brought through those judgments. So we still have some of that in the Christian life today. Now let's go 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1 to 11. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. Right? And they had bread raining down from heaven. So the flood it was a picture of it starting as they went through the Red Sea, and it was sort of a picture of it continuing as this bread falls from heaven. And then finally, after the 40 days are up, it stops raining, or the 40 years are up. They enter into that rest, right? Noah means rest, and they enter into the promised land of Canaan. But here I'm just showing you how that baptism actually was going through the Red Sea as well. That we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Right? So what is he saying? He's saying that the first century church, our types are fulfilling, they're actually types that are fulfilling some of those old covenant shadows of the people in the wilderness. And then he says, they were written down for our instruction. He says, and as an example, I just want to see something. All these things are types, things as types did happen to those persons as they were written down for our admonition. So this is Young's literal translation. It actually says types. Examples is not such a good word because they're not just mere examples of something like this. They're actually types. Right? Jesus said, I've come to fulfill that law. So again, these disciples in the first century were types. They were fulfilling those types, to whom the end of the ages did come. Written down for our admonition, to whom, what? To them in the first century, the end of the ages had come. Right, the early church saw the past events not as global, but as spiritual in fulfillment. So there's not some sort of physical fulfillment to a physical shadow. There's actually a spiritual reality to a physical shadow, and that's what was happening in the first century. It never is the other way around. That would contradict his covenant to Noah as well. End of the ages refers to the only end the Old Testament foundation speaks of. The Olivet Discourse stands as a prophecy concerning one event, destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, I do want to look at one more verse. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, where it talks about this end. Daniel chapter 9. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince, right, who's the Prince of Peace, that's Jesus, who is to come, shall destroy the city, right, that's what happened, that was Jerusalem being destroyed, and the sanctuary, that was Jerusalem, AD 70, its end, what's its? The city, right, there was the holy city, the beloved city, Jerusalem, spoken of through the whole Bible. That physical city was destroyed. Its end shall come with what? A flood. Right? So let's see, even in the Young's literal translation, verse 26. The city and the holy place are not his, the leader who hath come to destroy the people, and its end with a flood, until the end is war, determined our desolations. So that's sort of the literal language. Where did we see that? Shall destroy the city and its sanctuary, its end shall come with a flood. So that was verse 22 or R22. Let's just check this again. The city and the holy place are not his, cut off his Messiah, the leader of who hath come doth destroy the people, and its end. So it's the people, sometimes referred to as the city. In Proverbs, we see a man without walls as a city, or a man without self-control is a city without walls, right? So sometimes it's the body of believers is called the city, right? Its end is with a flood, until the end is war, determined our desolations. So this verse was to just show you how it was when this destruction of the city, the holy place, and was to be when the flood was. So this is the verse I believe you can hang your hat on and say this, because he's talking about the fulfillment of the 70 weeks prophecy, which had to be, everybody agrees, in the first century sometime. Although there's not agreements on exactly when that was, that this is the prophecy that actually shows the exact date of Jesus' birth and when his ministry was and when this destruction of the holy city would be. So that is something that I am going to probably study more in the future as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you understand that the flood was not supposed to be this global event, but that in fact, if we understand the culture and the mindset in the Old Testament, that it was local and it was to be imminent and unexpected, like a flood, right? So it's not to be taken as this global thing or as terms of scale, but in terms of intensity. And of course, the Hebrews spoke very passionately. And I just want to thank you for watching. This was the Like the Days of Noah study. And we'll see you next time.